Our special guest tonight is Professor Phil Zuckerman of Pitzer College. He is the author of many works situated at the intersection of atheism, global demography, sociology, and ethnography. Among his works are, I've actually read them all, Faith No More, Why People Reject Religion, The Excellent Society Without God, What the Least Religious Nations Can Tell Us About Contentment. Actually, this one I haven't read. The 1999 Strife in the Sanctuary, Religious Schism, or I guess schism, as they say in England, in a Jewish community. And he is the editor of the volume, The Social Theory of W.E.B. Du Bois, right? Not Dubois, right? I'm thinking of Joshua Dubois of the Office of Faith-Based, right? His forthcoming work, and I've also read it, it's not out yet. This is going to be a big one. I think it's going to put him even more on the map. He's already on the map in terms of people who think seriously about these issues in the United States. He shared it with me. I went through the first 8 chapters, and I couldn't put it down. One proposed title is In the Now, The Values and Virtues of Secular Life. He is also kind of a milestone figure. He is the director of the first program in secular studies on the undergraduate level in this country. There's a major now in the study of secularism, so things are really starting to take shape. Enough. Dr. Zuckerman, welcome to Georgetown University.
Thank you so much. Thank you. You have to clap louder. It's such a big room.
Yeah, it's a big room.
No,
big room. An extra smattering of applause. All right, well, for about half a century now, Dr. Zuckerman, sociologists have been tracking the existence of the nuns. In fact, in our audience, we have 2 pioneers, right, in terms of the demographic study. That's Professor Kaiser, who we'll hear tomorrow, and Professor Kosman, who we heard earlier today. And now I think they've cracked open the field for other researchers, maybe the next generation, such as yourself, to start looking at these people. So enough with me. Tell us, who are these nuns? There's a lot to tell us. What's the first thing you want to tell us about the nuns?
I guess in terms of describing the nuns, yeah, I rely on Barry Kosman and Ariella Kazar's data so much, but there's more as well out there. So I don't quite know where to begin. There's sort of I can paint a demographic picture. I can talk about their worldview and experience. Do you want both?
Let's start, the Pew study came out and it kind of supersized the national conversation, even though there were earlier conversations from Kaiser and Kosman. Let's start this way. Give us the basic raw facts for the uninitiated.
Okay. Well, let me think here. I'll start with demographics. So we know there's an age issue at play. So in terms of who identifies as being not religious, the older Americans are least likely to identify as such, and younger Americans are most likely to identify as such. So in fact, the Pew found that around 19% of Americans say that they have no religion or they're non-religious. But if you go to under 30, the 20-somethings, between 18 and 29, it's around 32% are ticking non-religious. So age is huge right there. And in fact, I should point out that 20 years ago, when 20-somethings were asked their religious identification, those who describe themselves as evangelical Christians was double that of non-religious, 2 to 1. That has flip-flopped in 20 years. So now among 20-somethings, there are twice as many people saying non-religious or none, N-O-N-E, as evangelical Christian. Okay, what other patterns do we see? Obviously, there are secular people of every shade and stripe and ethnicity and race and background and tradition, but we do see some patterns. So the most consistent pattern, and that's not just here in the United States, but it's universal, is that men generally self-identify as secular more than women, on average. So it's not, all men are secular and all women are not, but the average is so consistent that men often tend to identify more as being non-religious than women on a host of variables. But if self-identification is. Next, we see certain patterns related to racial ethnic groups. These are just patterns. These are just averages. They're not absolutes. But we see that rates of being non-religious are a bit higher, the highest among Asian Americans, actually, and higher among white Americans, lesser among Latino or Chicanos, and lesser among African Americans. There are many African-American secular groups around and secular people, and Latinos as well are increasing, but the patterns show certain differences. Those are the biggies. Politically, we know that people that designate non-religious tend to vote left-wing, tend to support the Democratic Party. They may be more likely to register as independents, as we saw this morning, but their voting patterns are very consistent in terms of generally heading towards the Democratic Party, a vast majority. In terms of, I guess, those are the big demographics. Those are what we have the numbers from. But if I could give an ethnographic view, I spent a lot of my time actually interviewing non-religious people from all walks of life, from all parts of the country. And I would say that what is not shown in the numbers is that most people who checked non-religious are not strongly anti-religious. They're just relatively indifferent. They just don't care about it. It doesn't have much meaning for them anymore. Most of them were raised religious, but they're no longer religious. And I think that needs to be stressed, that your average none, N-O-N-E, is simply occupying themselves with other things, be it skiing, raising their children, excelling at work, cooking, whatever it is, hiking, that they find their sense of being and their sense of identity in other ways, not in being anti-religious. That's a small minority of really ideologically driven or hurt apostates who had bad experiences or whatnot. But the vast majority, I would say, of non-religious people are sort of benignly indifferent to religion in general.
So let's get to that, because I think when the statistics were coming out, I'm thinking about that new atheist moment about 2004, 2005, and you had Daniel Dennett with the Bright Manifesto, right?
Okay.
Susan Jacoby and Free Thinkers, right?
Okay.
And there was this assumption that at that point it was 16%.
That's
the
right.
latest studies, which came from our good colleagues, there was this assumption that these were kind of a cadre, right? A column of non-believers who were ready to go, ready to be mobilized, and they were in the camp. So Dennett spoke of 30 million Americans who were about to shout those fundies and George W. Bush down. From what I'm seeing now, everything that Kaiser and Cosman are showing us and the other polling outfits, and your research as well, it would be an error to assume these are all atheists and agnostics, correct? That is not, what percentage of those are they?
Thank you. First of all, what do you mean by an atheist or an agnostic? Do you mean someone who self-labels as such? Or do you mean the orientation of being without a belief in God or uncertain about a belief in God? These are two very different things. In every survey we ever see, whether it's an American survey, European survey, Asian survey, India, if you ask people, are you an atheist? Very few will say yes. Wow. They don't like the term. It's a stigmatized term. It's an angry term. If you ask people, do you believe in God, far more will say no. So they are atheists in orientation, but not self-designation. So this is what guys like Stark love. That, only 2% of Americans are atheists. Well, yeah, in terms of self-labeling. But if you actually look at Cosman and Kazar's ARIS data, when they, thank goodness for this, I go to bed every night with a picture of them and I kiss it and put it under my pillow. They actually went into the none population and said, okay, you're none. You pick none. Now, when it comes to your belief in God, where do you fall? I'm an atheist, less than 10% will check that. But if asked, I don't believe in God for sure, I'm not so sure, who can say, it's unknowable. When we add up, I don't know, when we add up those kinds of responses, almost half of the nones, N-O-N-E-S's, are actually atheist or agnostic in orientation, but not self-designation. So I just want to say that. Now, also, even if you are an atheist or agnostic, though, that doesn't necessarily make you a political force. It doesn't mean you want to join a movement. It doesn't necessarily mean you want to subscribe to a magazine.
Might it mean the very contrary, given the very individualistic nature of atheists and agnostics?
There's definitely something to be said for that. Most people who were raised religious and for whatever reason walked away from it. Either they lost faith, or they were mad at the pedophile priest scandal, or they're upset about X, Y, and Z,
or they
George
were abused,
Bush,
either psychologically or
right. Most people that walk away from religion, either because of a negative experience or they just read some Camus or Sartre or whatever, whatever the reason, and I've interviewed a lot of people like that who took philosophy. Often, in fact, religious studies does the trick, but we can get into that. And this is really important. In fact, people often think the hard sciences are so corrosive to religious faith. Absolutely not. It's the social sciences. It's anthropology, psychology, philosophy, sociology. These are the things that really corrode people's faith. I mean, you can study the physical world, and it's just, God's wonders or whatever. Anyway, I digress. The point I'm trying to make is even people that walk away from religion either for benign reasons or because they're feeling something, most of those people walk away from it, and they don't think about it too much, and one of the things they didn't like about it was a sort of herd mentality. They didn't like the forced tradition. They didn't like the oppressive morality that was dictated from above. They didn't like the sanctimoniousness. They didn't like the forced worldview and the dictates and the pulpit. So for them, there isn't a real strong individualism, which seems to go hand in hand with at least the American version of secularity. And so there is a resistance to joining a group. Why would I join a group, atheists, an atheist group, where we sit around and mull over our shared values and our shared ideologies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the vast majority of secular people do not join such groups, are not members. In fact, I would estimate that only about 5% of secular people, and that includes atheist agnostics, and 5% is actually, I may be even inflating that a bit. The data suggests it's maybe even lower, actually actively put being secular at the forefront of their identity, so much so that they would want to join a secular humanist group or subscribe to a secular humanist magazine or get involved. Now that may be changing. We're seeing it change at the campus level with Student Secular Alliance seems to be booming, but again, it's still a very small percentage.
Now, you very kindly walked us through the demography. Your specialization is in ethnography, and you are a crack ethnographer. You speak to people, you get them to speak to you.
Okay.
You travel the world, you're in Denmark, you're in Sweden. Here's a funny question. Have you ever, is there like a trans-global nun quality that you're noticing in all your visits? They all have this quality, or are they so different from one another that you just can't predict or find these recurring patterns?
Well, they're all extremely eloquent and good-looking.
Well,
No. This is what I would say. Is there a trans-global secular identity, something they share? I mean, we could just input trans-global religious identity, and we would see how obviously that wouldn't stand up. There's nothing, we can't say that religious people from all over the world, whether they're in the Bolivia or Beijing or Stockholm or Chile or...
But what about very high educational attainment? Isn't that something you keep seeing?
Okay, let me get to that. So, the data there, I believe, and maybe my sociology colleagues can chime in at some point, but my understanding is the common perception is that education is corrosive to religious faith. And there is some data about that. When we look at if people only receive the high school education versus a BA versus postgraduate versus, that rates of biblical literalism go down, rates of belief in Satan go down, like the literal fundamentalist beliefs do go down with education. But in terms of who is an NONE right now, their educational attainment, at least in terms of college attainment, is not that much different from religious migrants. So it's tough. I think the jury's out on that. But what I would say in terms of what transglobal, if I had to say of all secular people share obviously a disinterest in religion, either a benign neglect of it or it just doesn't resonate for them, and whether it's religious beliefs, behaviors, rituals, or self-identification, it's just not on their list of important things about themselves. That would be one thing they share. That said, though, after that, the differences abound and are aplenty. And should I give some examples? I don't know where we're at time-wise.
Sure.
Okay. I mean, the biggest example I saw, for example, comparing Scandinavians who are non-religious to Americans, is Scandinavians who are secular don't think much about religion. If anything, if it's just not on their radar screen, and if anything, they kind of they think it's nice. Yeah, Jesus, he was a nice fellow. The church does good things, and I would never go there, but it's fine. And religion, well, it's okay, it's fine. What's the problem? They have no interest in it. They don't believe in God. They're not thinking about religion too much, and they're certainly not aggressively anti. I found that a bit different among American secular people. Again, most are just non-interested, but you're much more likely to find secular Americans who are extremely knowledgeable about religion. There was that national survey that came out 2 years ago that said atheists knew more about basic facts about religion than any group, and they're much more. They can be a bit more resentful about religion. They tend to see religion as causing problems. They're much more critical of it. And I would argue the difference is there is quite simply that religion is so quaint in Scandinavia that secular people don't fear it, aren't annoyed by it, aren't bothered by it, because it's so diluted and it's so benign. Here in the United States, when you have Newt Gingrich, saying that secularism is a threat to America worse than Nazism, when we have a strong religious right, secular people tend to be a bit more defensive, a bit more critical, a bit more aware, so that your average Scandinavian secular person sees religion maybe as a nice tropical fish, whereas an American secular person is a bit more likely to see religion as a shark out there that you need to watch out for.
This point you make about certain types of study or inquiry corrode religious belief. I once had a colleague, an expert on terrorism here at Georgetown University, and he used to joke with me, "You've never seen an art history major become a jihadi." Now think about it, right? If you look at who the jihadis are, often they are very well educated, and it's always engineering, all right? It might be medicine, right? But it's always engineering and science, and that's something that is unique to the Islamic world. So are you finding that the humanities, right, as you think about all the people you've interviewed, is it something about studying the humanities in particular on a serious college or MA level that really, I don't want to say makes one irreligious, makes one far less amenable to traditionalist religious interpretations?
I don't really have the data there, and I would prefer to speak from that, but I would say that either way, whatever the data does show on that front, we would still be left with the question of which is the chicken and which is the egg. Do certain personality types, are they drawn to the humanities, right? Or is it that we can shovel people to the humanities and they emerge with certain sensibilities that what comes first? I mean, I wonder that all the time. Are secular people, just to give another example, does being secular cause them to be left-wing politically? Or does being left-wing politically cause a person to be secular? Or are both caused by some third variable that we haven't yet identified, like watching a lot of Jon Stewart, or I don't know. That's my latest theory.
All right, so now I've got a picture of gentlemen boxers up there. Can we get our gentlemen boxers? Are they there? There they are, our gentlemen boxers, because we have decided, Dr. Zuckerman and I, to have a very gentlemanly scrum, right, in the most noble traditions of masculine gentlemanliness.
Can I be the taller one?
You are the taller one. You are the taller one.
Just for once.
And let's just
enjoy that fantasy.
Let's just have this disagreement. Let's just get it out there, right? There are these nomenclatural sort of almost pissing contests, right, between many in the whole non-belief movement, which is pretty large, right, and pretty diverse and pretty varied. So I'm going to put up on the screen a couple of definitions. The first one is Charles Taylor on secularity, right? Can you read it? Because I'm actually at an angle.
A move from a society where belief in God is unchallenged and indeed unproblematic to one in which it is understood to be one option among others and frequently not the easiest to embrace.
Okay, and then there are 800 more pages where that came from. Right? All right, good, so there's that. Let's put Berliner Blau, if you wouldn't mind, I'm not trying to force you to read Berliner Blau.
Okay, secularism is a political philosophy which, at its core, is preoccupied with and often deeply suspicious of any and all relations between government and religion. It translates that preoccupation into various strategies of governance, all of which seek to balance two necessities. One, the individual citizen's need for freedom of or freedom from, I like that, religion, and two, a state's need to maintain order.
Great, all right, so, but you use secularity really as, and I was tracking it, reading all of your stuff and enjoying reading your stuff. It really does, usually about 90% of the time when Professor Zuckerman uses the term, it does seem to me to be non-belief either, right? Atheism, agnosticism, skepticism, or free thought. So tell us about your definition of secularism, and then maybe we can mix it up.
And then have a pissing contest.
And then have a pissing contest, why not, right?
And then I'll see if you tattooed that definition on your ass. Okay, sorry, joke from earlier today that I really like. Okay, I have a lot to say here.
Please, the floor is yours.
Max Weber, the great German sociologist, right, wrote many books on religion. He wrote a book on religion in ancient India, religion in China, ancient Judaism, not to mention Protestant and spirit of capitalism, and analyses of Protestantism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He did not ever offer a definition of religion. Right. He wrote somewhere that the definition of religion will come at the end of my research, not at the beginning, and of course he died before that. So here's the founder, one of the main founders not only of sociology, but of the sociology of religion proper, who could not or would not define religion. So as we all know in this room, religion is notoriously impossible to define. There are substantive definitions, functionalist definitions. I just read two sociologists out of Norway who also in their intro text to the sociology of religion went through all the various definitions and then abstained from saying what theirs is. I mean, religion is almost impossible to define. So it doesn't surprise me that secularity, secularism would also be difficult. And earlier this morning when you were saying, we wish on our enemies confusion or whatnot, and you were talking about the confused attempts to define religion as a debilitating. And I agree with you in a strictly political sense, but I don't agree with you in an analytical or conversational or other world outside of the political sense. So I just wanted to preempt with that. What I would say is I differentiate between secular or secularity and secularism or secularist. To me, secular simply means non-religious. So whatever religion is, secular to be secular would be not that. So in a society, and secularity is merely the state of being secular. It doesn't necessarily mean you're ideological about it. It doesn't even mean you're very self-aware of it. I can't tell you how many Danes and Swedes I interviewed who, when I asked them about their beliefs in God, sort of said, well, you know, who can say? I don't really, maybe there is, maybe there isn't. I'd say to them, so you're agnostic. And they would say, what's that? I mean, they didn't even know what they, there's many definitions of agnostic, but one is that you can't really say, maybe there is a God, maybe there isn't. Who can say? And they say, yeah, that's me. But they didn't even have a label for it, right? So, where was I? Okay, so secularity can be very self-aware, very self-conscious, or just simply living life. I mean, my grandparents were Bundist socialists from Poland who were aggressively anti-religious. My other grandparents were from Bohemia, and they were not anti-religious. They were into skiing. I mean, both were secular. One was, Marxist. The other was outdoorsy. Okay, now, so for me, secular simply means the lack of religiosity or the lack of not being religious. Now, that's going to be predicated then on every version of being secular is relative to what religion is like in that culture or society. So in a society where religiosity is strictly ritualistic, beliefs don't matter, they're not talked about, it's just what you do. You say these, you do this, you don't eat that, you don't masturbate, whatever it is, then being secular in that society would be one who doesn't do those things, isn't interested in performing those rituals. And atheism may not come into play at all. But in a culture or society where religiosity privileges belief in God, like the United States, where Protestantism is the gold standard. I mean, when we talk about religion in the United States, sure, there's a diversity of religions, but the cultural force in America for the last 200 or so years has been a very specific kind of religion, Protestant Christianity being the gold standard, which is about congregating on Sundays in a certain way, maintaining a faith and belief in the Bible, belief in God, and belief in Jesus. So in the United States, to be religious usually means, not always, we know Jews, we know Buddhists, we know Hindus, but for most Americans, to be religious means having some type of belief in a God. So hence, in the United States context, being secular is often synonymous with, I privilege the non-belief. But I would agree with you that secularity is not reducible to that or necessarily equivalent to that, but it often is in a certain cultural context. What it means to be secular in India is going to be very different from what it means to be secular in Wichita. So for me, being secular is just the absence of religiosity, but of course, I tend to equate it with atheism or agnosticism because of the culture I live in where that seems to be privileged. Secularism, to me, the ism there implies ideology, political movement, social movement, the way things ought to be. To be secular, you may not have any agenda at all, a cultural agenda, a political agenda, you're just into skiing. But when you add secularist or secularism, now we're in the realm of, I want to make society a certain way, I want to shape things a certain way, I want to see the world, I want to see my worldview prevailing, I want to see, so within secularism,
politically speaking, that way is?
What I would say is, within secularism, now we have branches of the family tree. I would talk about political secularism being one branch. I could also talk about cultural secularism. When XTC, I don't know if you remember this band out of England, they live in Swindon. In 1980-something, they came out with a big hit called Dear God. Dear God, sorry if I don't know if you remember this song. This was a cultural secularist agenda. They weren't talking about separation of church and state. They weren't talking about limiting this or that. They just wanted people to not believe. It was about like, let's not believe this stuff anymore. So you can have cultural secularism. You could have political secularism, and I think you could even have other types of secularisms So to me, political secularism is but one branch. And so I think just as you can critique me for conflating secularism with atheism and agnosticism, I would critique you for narrowing secularism to the political.
Right.
When there's other manifestations of it. Camp Quest, for example, is a camp for the children of non-believers, freethinkers, atheists. They celebrate secularism as a worldview. They celebrate the ideals of freedom of free thinking and free inquiry and love of nature and science and reason. But it's cultural. They just want to have a camp to stimulate these values and this outlook and give a sense of community. It's apolitical, though.
All right, so a little pushback, because
Okay.
Washington, right? So you're right. Weber, in his almost endless, I once had a sociology professor who said, could you imagine if Max Weber had word processing software, how much he would have written, right?
That's so true.
You're right. He never did give us a definition, and it's one of those great paradoxes of his work. But Durkheim did, and we liked it, right? A system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things. And it kind of fomented a discourse, either good or bad, for a good 60, 70 years among social scientists, and there were others. So I guess my first question for you is, when one of your youngsters at Pitzer, right, goes in, I guess there's an intro to secularism course. What's your gateway course called?
Well, we actually we're working on that.
Okay.
So right now they can take classes in skepticism, secularism, and critiques of religion. They can take sociology of secularity. We have a secularism local global that I'm teaching this semester, but we're still trying to create the intro course.
So in office hours, let's say, right, Junior comes to you and she says, so Professor, what is it again? I'm majoring up in this. I just want to know. So you're telling her, I would imagine, you're going to say, well, it's probably atheism, or it's probably some form of non-belief, or how would you steer the young woman?
Just like when I teach sociology of religion, I walk in the first day and I have a handout of all the different definitions, from Geertz to Wilson to Durkheim to Yinger to everybody. And I say, in my own, and I say, and Stark's, and I say, here are 10 definitions of religion. Which do you like best? Which do you find problematic? Why? And we just talk about the discussion. Same thing with secularity and secularism. And in fact, we don't, that's why we call it secular studies, not secularism studies. So I would say what I try to convey is there's different meanings to these terms. In India, it means one thing. In here, it means something else. There's a variety of approaches. There's different definitions. And if they asked me, my personal one, okay, I might say, well, I think being secular means areligious, non-religious, irreligious. I would even go further, though, and say, there's a debate on, is secular just a lack of something, or is it a positive affirmation of something? A lot of my colleagues who are skeptical of secular studies say, well, you can't just have a major that studies what people aren't or what people are against. And there's something to be said for that. There is something to be said for that. But to be secular also can be constructed as an affirmative, positive worldview, and we could go into all the aspects thereof.
Okay, so pedagogically, I commend you. That's great.
Okay.
That's the way I do it.
Okay.
That's the way it should be done. You stack up the definitions, and kids, let's discuss. Now let's talk politically, right?
Yes.
What are the disadvantages, the potential disadvantages for American secularism, whatever that is, if it's construed as atheism and agnosticism? Here's one glaring disadvantage. They're so unpopular. We're so unpopular, right? It's not their fault, right? But they're one of the most stigmatized communities in Western civ, at least since early modernity, right? So politically, in trying to erect or build a formidable secular movement by making it a synonym for atheism, is there not a sort of drawback to all of that, that the coalition stays small, maligned, and marginalized?
I wish I could disagree with you and we could really spar, but I'm going to totally agree with you. If the goal here, and I think your book is fantastic, and the only thing I had issues with I brought up this morning, I think you're absolutely right.
That's it? That was the only
That was the only part where I was like, what? I wrote there, come on. What I would say is, if the political goal is religious freedom and freedom from religion and separate, as much as so on and so forth, then we want as broad an umbrella as possible, coalitions with like-minded religious people, and I would definitely not want to make secularism be synonymous with atheism at all. And in fact, this is the point which over and over and over again our founders kept asserting, was that it's bad for religion too.
That's it.
This is such an important trope to be constant. It's so strange that we have to keep asserting this. You know, you would think that students of American history would understand where the founders were coming from. That it's not about, you know, this keeping religion. What was it? Grant who said, I forget who, but you know, keeps them both more pure. Madison, I don't remember who. Sorry to put you on something, but you know, when we keep church and state separate, we keep them. They're both better off.
Roger Williams for
yeah,
one, right?
I mean,
Absolutely.
so to me, that should be the political goal. That should be the political goal, and I would definitely agree that if it's just seen as atheism, that's a real big PR problem.
Right, so you've got two Jews, two sociology professors, right? Two atheists, right? Two guys who study the exact same thing. And I think the distinction here is crucial. There's a pedagogical way of approaching this term, and there's a political way. And since we're in agreement, let's move forward, right? But I think that's a very, very important distinction between how we teach it and how it might grow, right, as a formidable social movement. So let's get to some of your research in Society Without God, which I really enjoyed reading because I like the way you write. I like scholars that care about their audience, right?
Okay.
So I feel the job of the scholar is to render that which is complex in clear prose, right? That's what public scholarship is. So there's some incredible arguments in there. Why don't you talk to us a little bit about violence or the lack thereof in Denmark? There's some incredible reflections on how non-violent a society it is, and it is kind of a godless or secular society. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I guess the biggest misconception that most Americans have, and I don't know how prominent these misconceptions are in other societies, but they're not prominent in Scandinavia, but in America, there's definitely the sense that religion, and by that they usually mean a faith in God, not just, you know, rosaries or something, that religion is a necessary, uniquely necessary source of a well-functioning moral social order. This goes back to Edmund Burke. This goes back to Alexis de Tocqueville. This goes all the way to Newt Gingrich, Bill O'Reilly, Michelle Bachmann, and I mean, and in fact, I can't tell you how many secular people I've interviewed who themselves are non-believers, but will still say, yeah, but you have to have religion. I mean, how else can you have a good society? I mean, I don't believe it, but you know, I wouldn't want others to not believe it because, you know, you kind of have to have religion. This is such...
Voltaire, for example, had a very similar approach.
Absolutely. So, and many others. So there's this notion that, you know, religion, and by that they usually mean faith in God, sort of guarantees a peaceful civil society. By that, they primarily mean, like, not a lot of murder. And the facts around the world allow us to at least reject that hypothesis. It's not because secularism is the answer, but we can look at the most religious societies on earth and the least religious societies on earth, and the correlation, it's just a correlation, is so overwhelming. Japan, one of the safest societies in the world with the lowest rates of murder and violent crime. Scandinavia, among the safest societies in the world with among the lowest rates of aggravated assault and homicide. And keep in mind, in Scandinavia, they also have the most luxurious prisons ever imagined by human beings.
What are they like? Were you in one of these prisons?
I never went to, I was never in one. I did, however, tour several times the psych ward that was holding people who had committed violent crimes and murder and were awaiting psychiatric evaluation to see whether they were sane or not. I went there so often because my son's preschool was on the premises. It was called Psych Ward Kindergarten. And there were, in fact, 2 other preschools right next door. And every morning we walked by the courtyard where the inmates sat who had just committed violent crimes and murders and often escaped. And when I expressed some concern about this, the Danish parents were like, well, if they're going to escape the psych ward, they're probably going to run far away, so it's probably the safest place to have your kids in preschool. So what I found is that, in fact, among the most religious nations today, Colombia, El Salvador, the Philippines, we can throw Jamaica in there. These are the most violent with the highest murder rates. And the least religious societies on earth today, Japan, Scandinavia, et cetera, have among the lowest murder rates. Now, I'm not saying it's because there's, I'm not trying to make an argument that, oh, secularism lowers crime and religion increases it. I'm simply saying religion clearly isn't the panacea that the religious right would claim it to be. We can reject that hypothesis squarely. Obviously, what causes high murder rates and low murder rates has probably nothing to do with or very little to do, and has to do with economics and politics, et cetera, and culture, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it's just something that needs to be trumpeted. And better yet, if you're skeptical, compare the states. Look at the 10 least theistic states in America and the 10 most theistic states in the United States. Who has the highest murder rates? Oh my goodness. How about this one? You can check which states have the highest child abuse fatalities. I mean, can you think of anything more heinous? Kids being killed by their own parents. It's 3 times as high in Louisiana compared to Vermont. It's twice as high in Mississippi compared to Oregon. I mean, on every indicator of violence, whether it's homicide, aggravated assault, domestic abuse, killing of your own kids, the Bible Belt is where it's at.
But is there a mediating variable?
Absolutely.
Okay, I imagine
Absolutely.
there might be one or two.
Absolutely.
All right.
Again, I'm not saying it's because. There's obviously factors of poverty and history and culture and demography, et cetera, but the point is at least we can reject the hypothesis that religion is a necessary and unique provider of social harmony. No, that's not necessarily the case. Other things provide that. And I would further add, though, that I don't think secularism is totally out of the picture here. I don't think it's totally epiphenomenal. I mean, if we look at some of the greatest advances, I think, in human society, secularism did play a part. The shift from divine right of kings to from theocracy to democracy, you can thank secular Enlightenment thought for that.
That is secularism.
Right.
Yeah, okay, got it. Right.
And rights of women have been pioneered, championed, again and again, whether in India or the United States, by secularism. Sane sex education, pioneered by secularism. I'm trying to think of some more here. Help me out.
It's not all good. I mean, there's some research on the secular movements at the end of the 19th century. Again, I always point to my colleague Aurora now. She was showing me this stuff. I forget the authors, right? But we were reading this over about the incredible sexism, right? Sure. I mean, obviously, right, of the folks in the American Secular Union and the National Liberal League. It was there. And the homophobia, right?
And racism.
Right, and exactly. And on the other end of the spectrum, right, you had these nativist Protestant parties in the 1870s and the 1880s who spoke about separation of church and state and called themselves secular because they hated what they viewed as unwashed, disgusting, subhuman Catholics, right?
Okay.
So I do think it's important not to put secularism in the Hall of Fame as much as we both enshrine it. There's a dark side there as well.
Absolutely.
You are a really good ethnographer, and you have an ethnographer's eye for funny things, right, that are very telling. How many days did you go in Denmark without seeing a police officer? Tell us about this, or security apparatus of any sort.
I'm no criminologist, but when I've lived in Denmark for 2 years, and when we first arrived with my family, we were in Aarhus, the second largest city in Denmark, and we got there in the summertime, so there were music festivals. We didn't have a car. We were on our bikes. We were biking through the city to get to the best beaches, so we had to traverse the entire core of the city to get to the good beaches. We were going to the museums. We were sightseeing. We were going all over the city. And after a while, it suddenly dawned on me that I hadn't seen any police. Now, I wasn't looking for this, but it was a little bit like if you've ever had this experience, you're in an apartment, and suddenly the refrigerator stops vibrating, and you suddenly realize it's quiet, right? You weren't aware there was a noise until the noise ceased. Have you ever had that? Or the air conditioner suddenly kicks off? You weren't aware there was a noise until it suddenly stops. I suddenly realized I wasn't looking for police. I wasn't looking for the lack of police. It was just suddenly so powerful to me that there were no police. And I said to my wife, where are all the cops? I mean, I live in Los Angeles. And she said, well, what do you mean? I said, I haven't seen any police. She said, oh, you probably have. You just haven't, been noticing it. I said, okay, well, I'm going to get out my notebook, and we're going to go through every day that we don't see police. And I mean any kind of police. So that would include a police car, a police on a motorcycle, a policeman or woman on a bike, or a foot patrol. Any kind. I went 31 days in the heart of summer. This is when every Dane gets out from under their rock and enjoys some sunshine. 31 days. I'll never forget. And then one day we got in a friend's car and we were driving along this street that passes what I knew to be the police headquarters. Oh man, we're passing police headquarters. I'll never forget this. I think Lars was driving. As we pass the police headquarters, I see a guy in plain clothes standing at the entrance, which is glass doors, going like this. Now, what I did was I went back home to Claremont.
That didn't happen. Come on, that's fiction, man.
I went back to Claremont and was seeing police every day, on average 1 or 2 a day. And Claremont's a small little suburb of Los Angeles. So I guess my point that I tried to use as that anecdote was to simply say it is possible to have a sane, humane, peaceful society without much belief in God. There's other reasons for the peacefulness, the humanness, and in fact, I would argue the Scandinavians practice the teachings of Jesus in an amazing way, in practical, institutional ways, much better than your average American Christian or Christian part of America. But that's another story.
I really want to get to politics with you because I feel we'll really get your Irish up, right, if we go into the current. But a couple of quick questions. In the Cambridge Companion to Atheism, I feel this is important for our audience, you had posited the existence of 500 million to 750 million atheists worldwide. Let's not linger on it too much. Tell us a little bit about that finding.
Okay.
What does it make you think of? Are you confident in that finding? Is it smaller, bigger, potentially?
I'm absolutely ashamed and embarrassed of that article. Let me get that on record. That is like the worst thing I've ever written. Ariella, I'm so embarrassed that you even have to read that. Yes, this is what happened.
It's a good article. What I mean,
it's statistically flawed in a big, bad way. I was approached and asked to write an article, this is 7, 8 years ago, by Michael Martin, big philosopher. Oh, I'm doing this Cambridge Companion. You're a sociologist. Will you write a chapter on how many atheists there are in the world by country? And I thought this was something I could Google. I was like, oh yeah, sure. I mean, I'm a qualitative ethnographer. I took 2 statistics class, broke out in hives both semesters. But I was like, yeah, sure, how hard can this be? Well, I found that actually nobody had done such a tabulation. So I spent 6 or 7 months simply looking up internet national surveys of, in English. My French and Hebrew are atrocious. My Danish is not so bad, but very useful language. But the point was that I would just find what looked to me like legitimate surveys with random samples and so on and so forth. And from that, I would tally. It was very messy because the questions were asked differently in different surveys. So I had to kind of extrapolate, well, is this really identifying atheists? Is it just identifying secular people? I muddled it all together in horrible ways. And then the biggest mistake, which no one has yet caught, is let's say I found a survey that said, okay, X percent, I don't know, let's say 31% of Estonians don't believe in God. I would then look up, well, what's the population of Estonia? 1.6 million. Okay, what's 31% of 1.6 million? Does anybody know what's wrong with that? The population that I'm finding on Google is including children. The surveys are only asking people 18 or over. So I overestimated. Because I forgot that. Sorry, I tried really hard in statistics. But so I think, fortunately, Juhem and Ariella have written the state-of-the-art article that's coming out in the Oxford Companion pretty soon. That is so much better, and I appreciate. And so they actually estimate that worldwide it's somewhere between, I want to say, 450 million to 500. I mean, 450 million to 500 million. So I think it's somewhere closer to 500 million.
That Oxford Companion, it's going to be like 15,000 pages when all is said and done. Yeah. It's just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. All right, so I really like when you write about children and you write about your own children. So let's cast forward a little bit. So you're doing all this ethnography amongst non-believers in this country. Yeah. What do they talk to their kids about? All right, what types of issues come up? And let's not do the Pledge of Allegiance right now. Just what's family life? What's family life like? What do you notice?
Yeah. Well, so first of all, it depends where the family lives. This is the biggest factor. If you're raising your kids in Berkeley, if you're raising your kids in Vermont, if you're raising your kids in Eugene, it's pretty much a non-issue, and you're taking them to soccer, and you're hiking, and you're doing whatever. If you're raising your kids in Nashville or outskirts somewhere in South Carolina or Arkansas or Alabama, then it's a huge problem. I've actually interviewed people who took their children, who homeschool their kids because the public school is too religious. Why is that interesting? The vast majority of homeschooled children are evangelical Christians who think the public school is too secular. I found mothers and fathers who had to band together to homeschool their kids because the school was too religious, the public school. So it really depends, and the parents in those parts of the country are struggling. Their children get harassed. Their children sometimes get abused, beat. I mean, I heard horror stories.
I believe it.
But
in the South in particular.
In the South in particular, although it could just be any religious part. I mean, it could be Eastern Oregon rather than Western Oregon. Okay. But that said, so that's the first big. Geographical location determines so much about how secular children are raised and parents. But that said, I think the biggest finding that I found, and what I find really interesting is, there's something paradoxical if you're a secular parent, and it's no fun. And it works like this. If you're a religious parent, then raising your child in the faith is a joy and a duty. It's clear. If you're a Muslim and you want to raise Muslim kids, that's what you do. You teach them about Islam. You force them to learn Arabic and recite the Quran in Arabic, even if they're in Malaysia, whatever it is. And you do it, and it feels right, and it feels good. If you're a Jew and you want to raise Jewish children, you do it, and it feels good. You explain to the kids about Judaism. You teach them about et cetera, et cetera. You get the point. However, most secular parents were raised with some type of religion. And to them, they see religion as a form of indoctrination. They feel like it is something that was imposed upon them by their parents or their grandparents, and they resented it. They felt like it was shoved onto them, these beliefs, this identity. So they're very sensitive to wanting their children to have autonomy, to think for themselves, and to make up their own decisions. We actually have a lot of data on this from Huntsberger and Altemeyer, et cetera, et cetera. So here's the paradox. If you're a secular parent, you actually don't want to impose your secularity on your kids, hence you're committing the same crime as a religious parent imposing on their children. So you're in a paradoxical situation. You want to raise your kids in the way you think is best, with the values you think are best. You want them to be as good humans as you can, which probably means you don't want to raise them religious, and yet you don't want to impose your atheism or agnosticism or secularity on them because that would be indoctrinating. So secular parents have a really hard time navigating this. And they don't quite know how to handle it. The typical response is to constantly say things like, when the kid comes home from school, Dad, do we believe in God? Because they said God in the Pledge of Allegiance this morning. What's our belief? Most secular parents will say, well, some people do, some people don't. This is the typical approach. And then the kid will immediately say, but what do you believe? And a hard secular will say, no. I mean, that's what my daughter said. She said something about, well, my second daughter said, well, there had to be a God because where did everything come from? And I was driving and I said, well, that's true, but then where did God come from? And she said, well, that's easy, God's mother. And I said, nice, where did God's mother come from? Well, God's grandmother. And I said, and where did she come from? And it's turtles all the way down. So, that maybe was a bad parenting moment, but I couldn't resist. Then soft seculars will say something like, you know what, I personally am not sure, it's hard to say, you should read about it, you should talk to a lot of people about it, and make up your own mind. But it runs the gamut. The other thing that secular parents sometimes stress over about is they fear that they're raising their kids as nothing. And this causes them worry and concern. They want them to have a sense of belonging, a sense of community, an experience of community, a sense of identity, and they fear, well, Jimmy's Catholic and Josh is Jewish and so, Ahmed is Muslim. Well, what are we? Mom, Dad, what are we? And most of them, they'll say, well, I tell them that we're nothing, but it feels bad. I don't know what else to say. And then I'll say to them, well, why don't you tell them they're a secular humanist? And they'll say, like, what was it, Patrick Moynihan? Well, what's that? And I think actually the cultural secularist in me feels like it's my job to help those nuns out there articulate what it is they do believe and what their worldview actually it consists of. So I'm actually more interested in sort of disseminating secular humanism as a cultural affirmative life stance than the political battle, although obviously I want to wage that too, and I'm glad you are.
For one other opinion about what happens with these types of kids, I sent my kids to a Sunday school, which is a good, liberal, reformed Jewish Sunday school.
Okay.
One of them is Christopher Hitchens Jr. He's a hardcore new atheist, and the other might be the Lubavitcher Rebbe. So there's no way of, they've clearly rejected reform.
Nice.
But they're very happy there, right? Because the finger painting is nice.
One of the things I particularly liked about your book was the hyphenated identity situation. Jews, of course, the Jewish secular people I talk to kind of had it easy because their kids were still Jewish. They just didn't believe any of the stuff. They didn't have to do the stuff, but they had that sense of community, that sense of heritage. Very important. Secular parents have a really difficult time with heritage. This link to future and past generations. We just don't have it. But in Scandinavia, most Scandinavians are Lutheran. I mean, to be a Dane or a Swede or a Norwegian is to be Lutheran. They are literally synonymous. And yet they're non-believers. They have the lowest rates of church attendance in the world. They couldn't even tell me a Bible story when I asked them. And yet they had a strong connection to Lutheran heritage. I think that's a wonderful thing. And I think if we could have secular Catholics, secular Muslims, secular Lutherans, as we have secular Jews, the world will be a much better place.
In fact, tomorrow, Reverend Dr. Thistlethwaite is going to speak to us about hybridity, which I think is one of these great secular concepts in the making, right? That one can be a couple of things and like them all without prioritizing. One other thing before we get to politics, because politics is going to be fun in the spin cycle of our wash today. Death. You talked, I mean, what's so interesting, I want to stress, the new book takes the great research of Cosman and Kaiser and kind of puts a human face on it, right, as ethnographers do. Just gets in there and speaks to these people and listens to their stories. You speak to people about death in the new book, and you speak to people who are incredibly at peace with death. And I want to tell you, I've never been at peace with death. I don't want to die, all right? No, I don't want to die, and I don't want anyone I know who I like to die. But the folks you're interviewing, they're totally chill. It's like it's part of, are they Buddhists? What's going on there? Who are these people that are so at peace with death?
Yeah, they're not Jewish, I'll tell you that much. I think it's a Jewish thing. I'm terrified of death. I don't even like flying, to be honest. But there is actually some research that Jews have a greater degree of death dread than non-Jews. I won't get into that, but there is some psychological research there.
The Larry David phenomenon, is that it? Yeah, okay, could be.
But that said, yeah, the vast majority of people I've interviewed, as one Danish guy said to me, I try not to worry about things that I can't control or there's no point in, right? Let me just set up your question. So in the book I just sent the final manuscript to Penguin. It should be out next year. But the premise of the book was there's all these things that religion provides: community, comfort, in the face of tragedy or fear of death, how to raise your kids, morals and ethics, all the things that religion provides, and yet we're seeing this growth of non-religious Americans. So how are they getting the things that religion typically supplies? That was the premise of the book. And one chapter is on, well, okay, death is huge, right? Religion's got that covered. So how do non-religious people deal with death? And what I found consistently over and over again is most secular people will say the same thing. I don't want to die, but they're not terrified of non-existence at all. They'll say things like, I didn't exist 100 years ago, big deal, I won't exist, who cares? It's not an issue. That goes back to Epicurus and others. So the thought of not existing is not the problem. It's the actual suffering that might go involved in death or death itself.
And all the fun stuff you're going to miss.
And
you ever take a walk on a Sunday and there's all this great stuff going on?
So great.
And you like it, right?
Oh, I'm loving this coffee.
Yeah.
Okay, so, I mean, that's what Hitchens said. He said, when he got when he got his prognosis or diagnosis, I don't know, he said, I felt like I was being tapped on the shoulder and told to leave the party. And he said, no, it was actually worse. I was told to leave the party, but the party would continue on without me. So there's a couple things I will say. Number one, of course, in an in-depth interview face-to-face, when you ask people about death, they're probably going to downplay their fears and dread. I mean, who wants to sit there and say, actually, I'm terrified of it. I can't sleep at night. So there may be some, I don't know if face-saving is the right word, but there may be a desire to put the most positive spin on this for some people, But I will say this. I would say that what secular people do share is an acceptance of it. An acceptance of it. I will one day die. That's not only the way it is, but it's the way it ought to be. In fact, eternity seems like a nightmare. I mean, can you imagine living forever? What a fate worse than hell. I mean, can you imagine a great soccer game that never ended? Can you imagine an orgasm that never ended? I mean, that would be like hell, right? So a lot of secular people say, eternity would be a nightmare, and it's the way of nature. All that lives must die. And there's a real acceptance. So some people are afraid of dying. Some people are, like my wife, don't think about it too much, not scared of it. But there's what all secular people share is an understanding that this is it, and you die, and that's that. And what's so strange to me is why so many of my fellow humans, the vast majority, have a hard time accepting their own.
So you don't believe in ghosts, and it sounds like a crazy question because you are Zuckerman, right? And
Yes.
Philip Roth, right? Who's one of the
Yes.
great secular Jewish. Half of his fiction is about ghosts. Apparently, for him, ghosts are kind of real.
Yeah.
When we were house hunting in Washington, I told the real estate, we used to walk into houses and I used to sniff it, and I say, no, ghosts, gotta go. And we wouldn't buy the house. So you don't believe in ghosts, right? You don't believe in anything. It's all the material world, period. Full stop. End of sentence. There's nothing but this world. There's no Zuck essence that will perdure once you pass on, and I hope that's in a long time.
Thank you. I would not say that. I would say there's mystery, and there's more between heaven and earth than dreamt of in any philosophy, and there will always be great mystery to why there's something instead of nothing. I mean, I take an almost, I'm not going to say, I don't know what is out there. I don't know why I'm here. I don't know what will happen after I die. Nobody knows. But I do know that all the fanciful imaginings of humans are incorrect. That much. How do I know that? Well, now you got me. But I've read the Vedas, the Upanishads, obviously the Old New Testament, the Quran, all that stuff is human imaginings, and that I know. Are there ghosts? I don't think so, and no, I'm going to have to say no, there's not. Sorry.
Okay.
But there's still mystery out there. Deep, deep mystery. It's so mysterious we can't even talk about it or fathom it.
All right, so we're going to close out by lowering the lights if we can. I don't know if we can. And we're going to watch a little video of our president, Barack Obama. Then we'll speak for about a couple more minutes about politics. He said something very, very interesting at the recent National Prayer Breakfast, which is a huge flaming thorn in the side of many secular Americans. He's been doing this. This is number 4 or number 5. Aurora, we ready to go? This is President Obama National Prayer Breakfast. Listen carefully. I'm sure you'll catch it at the very, very end.
Even in those with whom you disagree most vehemently, the face of God, for we are all his children. That's what I thought of as I took the oath of office a few weeks ago and touched those Bibles. The comfort that Scripture gave Lincoln and King and so many leaders throughout our history. The verses they cherished and how those words of God are there for us as well, waiting to be read any day that we choose. I thought about how their faith gave them the strength to meet the challenges of their time, just as our faith can give us the strength to meet the challenges of ours. And most of all, I thought about their humility and how we don't seem to live that out the way we should every day, even when we give lip service to it. You know, as president, sometimes I have to search for the words to console the inconsolable. Sometimes I search Scripture to determine how best to balance life as a president and as a husband and as a father. I often search for Scripture to figure out how I can be a better man as well as a better president. And I believe that we are united in these struggles. But I also believe that we are united in the knowledge of a redeeming Savior, whose grace is sufficient for the multitude of our sins and whose love is never failing. And most of all, I know that all Americans, men and women of different faiths, and yes, those of no faith that they can name, are nevertheless joined together in common purpose, believing in something that is bigger than ourselves and the ideals that lie at the heart of our nation's founding, that as a people we are bound together. And so this morning, let us summon the common resolve that comes from our faith. Let us pray to God that we may be worthy of the many blessings he has bestowed upon our nation. Let us retain that humility, not just during this hour, but for every hour.
So Did anyone hear that reference to those of no faith halt that they can name? What is going on here? Can you exegete that one for us? Break it down, Zook. What is happening when the President of the United States speaks of those of no faith that they can name, after saying all the theologically tinged stuff he had just said?
Well, my hunch is that since it was the prayer breakfast, he just didn't want to upset all the religious figureheads that were around him. That's my polite answer. My honest answer is the whole thing makes me want to retch and puke that wonderful chicken apple lunch I had. Look, Barack Obama's mom was an atheist. Barack Obama's grandparents from, what was it, Missouri or Kansas, were non-religious. They didn't dig it. They opted out of their religious options. They quit the church and were not going to be involved. Barack Obama's first biological father was an atheist and then ducked out. Then his second father, who I think came when he was around 2, was an atheist. So Barack Obama was raised by secular, loving people. He knows their worldview. He knows that they have values. He knows that they have morals. He knows that they have a positive and humane approach to the world. So what's going on here? We have one or two options. One, this is just politics. He knows he has to present himself as a man of faith to stay a popular president or even to be president. And I'm sure when he decided to enter politics, that's when he realized, oh, I better get involved in church life or I'm going to have no political future. The other is he genuinely has converted to Christianity in his heart. I don't know which it is, and I'm willing to grant him either one.
Do you think this is his weird, hazy, murky way of giving a shout out and a thank you to those nuns, 70% of whom gave him their vote, and somehow, remember, during the summer he stopped talking, he stopped doing the God talk. And all of the religious pundits, there's some in this room, we were out of a job, right? There was nothing to write about, right? Except for the economy, which we didn't understand. Do you think this was Barack Obama's weird way of placating that group at the very event that drives them off the rails? You know how they react to this type. You think that might be it?
Weird way is the key operative phrase right there. Very weird. A really good shout out was when in his first inauguration, where he said we're a nation of Christians and Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists and non-believers. Boom. First time an American president ever said such a thing in the inauguration, no less. This wasn't a speech at NYU. This here, I think, was a very weird way to give a shout out because he managed to, if that was a shout out, it was very denigrating. I mean, it literally said what unites us all. He even said faith in a savior. A savior? Wow. No thanks.
He really got to the deep Christology, as he often does at the National Prayer Breakfast and the Easter Prayer Breakfast. He goes there, right? He goes to a place where even George W. Bush would not go, quite honestly.
It's fascinating.
All right,
and disturbing.
In terms of the nuns, final question for you. Assess the presidency of Barack Obama from what the nuns that you've met across the country are telling you. What do they make of this fellow? I think there's a real desire to love the man, right? There's somebody to love, and then there's that.
Your average NONE, your average one, loves Obama, hated Bush. In fact, it was probably the Bush administration that pushed them into the nun category. So they're thrilled. The more ideologically driven nuns, the ones that are involved in secular humanism, subscribe to free inquiry and FFRF, and the ones that are more hardcore have deep, deep issues, not only with this, but with the faith-based initiative stuff, and they find him very problematic, and they would like him to be much more supportive of separation of church and state. And so I think, they're obviously happy politically with him, but they have deep issues with his overt religiosity and what they see as his pandering to Christians, his support of a lot of stuff that they think is very problematic in terms of church-state intermingling. So that's my sense. But again, those are the minority of the greater secular camp.
And the final question, I read somewhere that by the year 2040, Latinos are going to be something like 40% of the United States population. Wonderful. What do you think about nuns 25 years from now? Do you think this is going to continue growing, or has it maxed out?
The trends in the data suggest it's on the rise. If you look at, for example, what percent of Americans were raised with no religion, 50 years ago, minuscule, 2-3%. It has inched up every decade. So 25 years ago, it was up to 7%. Now we see that the latest cohort, about 11% of Americans raised with no religion. So that keeps increasing. If we look at the data from who identifies as non-religious from 1957, as we saw this morning up to now, it keeps going like that. So it's not that it goes like this. It's not like, percentage of Americans raised with no religion, well, it comes up, it goes down, it comes up, down. Percent of Americans claiming to be non-religious, well, it goes up, it goes down. Or percent of Americans articulating an atheist or agnostic orientation, it goes up or goes down. No, it's going like that. So on that basis alone, I'm going to suggest it's on the rise. But we also have great longitudinal data on how people are raised. So I'll just quickly summarize it. When you have two parents of the same religious faith, the likelihood of their children sharing that religious faith is very high. When you have two parents of different religions, both religious but of different religions, suddenly the likelihood of their child being religious ticks down a bit. When you get to a situation where one parent is religious and the other is secular, it goes way down. And when you get to a situation where both parents are secular, almost 80% of the offspring of those marriages will stay secular. Maybe 84% if I'm correct from Hart Nelson's data. So that suggests that socialization is so key. Socialization is the driving force of why people are religious. It's not philosophical questions. It's not, fear of death. It's how they were raised. So if we see an increase of people being raised with no religion, the likelihood that their children will be secular is extremely high. Now, what will counter this? Well, things get worse, global warming gets worse, people will always turn to religion for comfort. But as things stay the same, I predict, with my crystal ball, that the rates of irreligiosity will continue to uptick, the percentage of kids raised without religion will continue to go up, and this will, I think, and we're seeing it in the Latino community as well, African-American community as well. I mean, all communities are seeing this uptick. I predict it will have significant political consequences. I could be wrong. Maybe I'm just it's a wish fulfillment here, but
the Denmarkification of the United States of America.
We'll see. If we could get universal health care, that would be nice.
Phil, this has been a great conversation. Let's get some applause for Phil Zuckerman.